Let me move on to this next subject because it's more important to me, to be quite honest with you, that this needs to be addressed. This involves New York Jets quarterback Aaron Rodgers because he's making headlines again off the playing field. Aaron Rodgers sat down with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson on his program on X in an interview released just this Tuesday. During the interview, Rodgers praised Russian President Vladimir Putin as, quote, interesting and smart individual. But to be specific, because we want to be fair, here's what Rodgers specifically had to say. Check it out.
You did one of the most controversial, somehow, not to me, most controversial interviews in the last, I don't know how long, when you went to Russia and did Putin. How did it feel coming back? Because like anybody who watched the interview was like, number one, it was fucking awesome. Number two, Putin came off as an interesting, thoughtful, smart individual. And if you've read 1984, you know the base game plan of government control is you have to have an enemy and you have to slander that enemy regardless if you know anything about him. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, Putin apologists are like, whitewashing all the stuff that he's done to different people. And I was just like, no, I'd love to see Joe Biden give an interview where he can speak on the history of the United States in the same way that Putin talked about the history of his country.
What's the problem with that, ladies and gentlemen? What's the problem? Now, I know that there are people out there that are going to have their back up a little bit because when you're talking about Vladimir Putin, you're talking about essentially a dictator. You're talking about the president of Russia who's invaded Ukraine. You're talking about everything from elementary schools to hospitals to buildings, et cetera, that have been bombed by Russia. It is clearly a war they instigated. Many, many lives have been lost along the way. And that is enough for you to say you don't want to hear about Putin being smart and interesting when some would consider him to be a very vile individual. Couple of things. Number one, everybody's entitled to their opinion. And number two, I didn't hear Aaron Rodgers speaking on behalf of the character or the moral compass of the Russian president. He was talking about how Vladimir Putin came off in that interview with Tucker Carlson. Both things could be true. You could be a vile, despicable human being. You could be a murderer. You could be a dictator. You could be a lot of different things. But sitting down for an interview, somebody might find what you had to say to be compelling and interesting. It's not a crime for Aaron Rodgers to convey that point of view. Whether you agree or disagree, he didn't step beyond the pale. He didn't step across the line and say something that should cause a national uproar. I do think it's gotten to the point where everything that Aaron Rodgers utters out of his mouth is taken in such a way that folks are looking for a reason to get at him. I don't think that calls for it. I really, really don't. Again, most of us would feel differently. That's not the thought that would come to our mind when we're thinking about Vladimir Putin in this particular day and age, considering what's going on in Ukraine and what we suspect and the things that we've said about his stewardship over Russia. But that ain't where Aaron Rodgers went. He was talking about what he said to Tucker Carlson in the interview. Let's learn to compartmentalize and isolate things on a case-by-case and a situational basis. That's all I'm saying. Nothing more about that. Let me go to the other part of the interview with Aaron Rodgers and Tucker Carlson, which lasted more than 2 hours, by the way, because it also focused on the pandemic and the ethics of the COVID-19 vaccine, which Aaron Rodgers opposed. Here's what Aaron Rodgers said regarding that.
I think it's time for a lot of us to maybe adjust some of the approach that we're doing. I mean, it obviously hasn't worked. We've been trying to wake people up, I think, with the studies that are out there now.
Exactly, with the science.
All the time, with the articles, with the change in stances by everybody from Chris Cuomo on down, who have, either had vaccine injuries or side effects or just look at things differently. And it's caused me to, I think, have a little bit more empathy and compassion for those people who had a ton of fear, thought they were doing the right thing.
Yes.
For themselves, for their friends, for their families, and went through all the mass formation psychosis that we all did.
Yes,
just
that's right.
Full court propaganda against us, and are now going, oh shit, maybe that wasn't the best. Maybe they lied to us. Maybe they weren't being truthful. Maybe this wasn't safe. So I think it's important for us to, if we want to make a difference, which I do, and I don't necessarily want to be way a part of the conversation anymore, is how do we call people forward to with compassion and kindness that just come over to the side of being awake to what's going on, because I think we all need to come to the grips that this could happen again.
Not so fast there, Aaron Rodgers. To crystallize matters, you may not have flat out lied, but you were a bit evasive, to say the least. And you did give false pretense as to whether or not you had taken the vaccine. You can take the vaccine, you can refuse to do so. A guy like Kyrie Irving, who was then a member of the Brooklyn Nets, he refused to take the vaccine. He was very honest and upfront about it. And a lot of people out there mistakenly thought I was getting on him for not taking the vaccine. I wasn't getting on him for not taking the vaccine. I was getting on him because it was the latest excuse for him to miss work. He had played 29 games that year. There was always a reason for Kyrie Irving to miss work. You ain't hear me say nothing but praise for him this year because he played. And he's been a star. And he's given the people what he signed up and swore to give them. Whether it's the Dallas Mavericks franchise now or what he should have done in Brooklyn and Boston before that, what he once did in Cleveland when he was the star there with LeBron James. Wasn't getting on him for not taking the vaccine. But in the case of Aaron Rodgers, you're going to have cynics and critics who felt you should take the vaccine. You're going to have others who felt otherwise. But because of the rules implemented by the National Football League, rules that you clearly wanted to circumvent, you were not forthcoming. You talked about being immunized. And you said you were immunized, giving an indication that you had taken the vaccine when indeed you had not. And at that time, because the world was scared shitless, because everybody thought that anybody who didn't take the vaccine was going to be in a position to potentially contaminate them with the vaccine if they ultimately acquired COVID, people having that innate fear because they were believing what Aaron Rodgers clearly was not believing, in my eyes, was enough justification for you to be honest about it and say, yo, I didn't take the vaccine. People had a right to know that because you were around teammates, you were around team personnel, you were around other people. They had a right to know that you were not vaccinated. So in that regard, Aaron Rodgers, you do not get off the hook. But everything else Aaron Rodgers said, ladies and gentlemen, how can we have a problem with that? You have some people who are staunch supporters of the vaccine. You have some people who are supporters of the vaccines and the booster shots, but now not supporters of the booster shots, even though they were supporters of the vaccine. You got others who are questioning the vaccine. You got people. Once upon a time, Dr. Fauci was such a huge figure, they had him throwing out the first pitch at Washington National games. Now the man retired. And you've got legislative officials wanting to go after him. You got some people in the public wanting him called to the carpet because they believe he's responsible for some of the things that have transpired in our society in a negative fashion, evolving around COVID-19 because of the panic it created. You've got debates taking place on national television courtesy of Fox News when the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, was debating against the California governor, Gavin Newsom. And what is Gavin Newsom? What has he been excoriated for? How he went into complete panic mode and shut down the state of California in such a fashion that not only did it cost the state billions, but they still haven't recovered. Whereas Florida doesn't have that problem. And Ron DeSantis is widely considered to have done a better job handling the COVID crisis than Gavin Newsom has. So as we sit here and we learn more and more information and learn more and more news, I'm certainly not pretending to know anything. I only know what I read. What I will acknowledge is this: whether right or whether wrong, no one can say anything definitively. I took the vaccine. Hell, I encouraged others to do it by doing PSAs and stuff like that. Fair enough. Others that disagreed with me, however, I can't knock them. They have the reasons for having their feelings. Aaron Rodgers is entitled to that. Just like Tucker Carlson is entitled to that. Just like folks like Chris Cuomo and others are entitled to change their minds once they've learned more and more about the facts. Popular podcaster Patrick Bet-Davis spoke about these things too. We learn more and more and more as we go on. The one thing that we're able to deduce from all of this, and we must peel from all of this, is that whether you agree with him or disagree with him, Aaron Rodgers is not stupid. He's not senseless. He's not the insensitive dude that people have excoriated him as being. And at least some of what he says, if not a lot more than some of it, gets attached with enough legitimacy to it that it will make you at least say it's something we need to discuss. We can no longer sit here and act like every word that comes out of Aaron Rodgers' mouth makes no sense and that he's completely clueless and he don't know what the hell he's talking about. The man ain't stupid. There are people like Joe Rogan and others who've agreed with him and a lot of the things that he has said. Just because we dislike things sometimes don't mean we get to dismiss it as completely false. I don't know. I don't know the answer to these questions. But neither do a lot of people who think differently than Aaron Rodgers. So if we don't know, who are we to say he doesn't know? It's worth listening to. That's all I'm saying. It's worth listening to instead of jumping to this conclusion that he's somebody that needs to be vilified and excoriated. I will say this about Aaron Rodgers, though. We really don't give a shit about what you're saying when you ain't throwing that damn football. Get your ass back on that football field and remind us that you that bad man that I know you to be, because you a bad brother throwing that damn football. That ain't some shit to be debated. We know ain't no debating that. You one of the best to ever do it. Get your ass back on the football field. Let's see you throwing more than talking. That much I will say.